I'd like to ask you, if you will, this morning, open up your Bibles and turn over to Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, that's where we're going to be looking here in just a moment this morning. But before we do, we want to take this opportunity to welcome everybody here once again. We do have quite a few visiting amongst us this morning. We're excited to have you here. And as we come together, we're excited that we're able to be together, aren't we? We're excited that we're able to be together because we have the opportunity to worship God. And that's the first and foremost reason that we're here. We are here to worship God. But as we do so, there are some secondary things that we get to, aren't there? We get to be built up by our brethren. We get to be edified. We get to open up to God's Word. We get to study it. And we get to better understand what does it say. Now, this morning, I would like to start off talking about bearded dragons for just a moment. And no, it's not just because I like them. It's because they have something about them that I want to bring up. Bearded dragons are solitary animals, and truthfully, they're selfish. They are very selfish animals that if you put more than one together in a tank, one will be dominant over the other and will not let it have its spaces, will not let it eat, will not let it do anything. One will be in control. We could probably say that, they're arrogant. They're selfish. They only think about themselves. And this is really opposite to what? Well, it's opposite to humility, isn't it? This morning, I want us to talk about humility. And the reason I do is because, as I was reflecting on the lesson given last week, reflecting on how do we overcome anxieties and worries, we talked about changing our mindset. We talked about humbling ourselves and how important that was. Now, I thought about that for a little while. And what I realized is that how often do we really talk about how do we become humble? We talk about we need to be humble, don't we? We say, be humble, change your ways, change your mindset. Great. How do I do that? This morning, that's what I want us to talk about. How do we become humble? But why have this discussion? Why sit here and why take the moments that we have this morning to talk about humility? And one of the first reasons is something that we brought up in class, and we're going to hear some of those things we brought up in class brought up again. But as we've said here before, and as we will continue, repetition is wonderful. So I'm not going to apologize for that. So why talk about humility? Well, we talk about it because just as when we look at Bible characters that were living then, they lived amongst men and amongst many men who refused to humble themselves. And we do the same. We live amongst men, and maybe there's some amongst our numbers this morning, I don't know, who refuse to humble themselves. And because we live amongst it, we need to be on guard for it. We need to be aware of what do we do for us. How do we make ourselves humble? Another reason we're going to have this study is because of how many times humility is actually brought up. Now, when we look at this meaning of humility, and looking and saying it's brought up 111 times, that's humility, humble, humbled, or humbly. Those 4 words. This does not include how many times the Greek or Hebrew word for humble is brought up and used in another sense. This is only those 4 words. 111 times. The other reason we're going to talk about humility this morning we find over in Colossians chapter 3. In Colossians chapter 3, we're not going to read all of verses 12 through 17, but what we find here is Paul telling the Colossians, saying, this is what you need to do as a new man. This is the character that you need to have. Let's read verses 12 and 13. He says, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. In order for us to receive the blessings, we talked about that this morning too, in order for us to receive the blessings that God has promised to us, in order for Him to give us these things, what is it that we must do? We must be humbled. If we refuse to be humble, if we think that that's just something that's low tier, if it happens, it happens. That's not a mindset in which we're going to receive the promises from God. And so we have to be humbled. So how? How do we become humbled? And this is one of the reasons I wanted to have this discussion this morning. Many times when we talk about how do we become humbled, we use these phrases. We say, well, you need to change your mindset. You need to focus on something else. You need to focus on the spiritual. I'm not saying you don't. I'm not saying you don't need to seek the Lord, because in order to humble yourself, you do need to seek the Lord. I'm not saying that you don't need to pray, but I'm saying we use these phrases a lot. We say, this is how we do it. But is this all that we do? Is this the only things required of us in order to humble ourselves? Well, no. What this really is the most vague way to say, this is how you humble yourself. It's the most broad sense of how to say it. But humbling ourselves is more than just seeking the Lord. There's more to it. I want us to turn over to 2 Chronicles this morning. In 2 Chronicles chapter 7, that's where we're going to be looking here. It says, verse 12, Then the Lord appeared to Solomon by night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among the people, if my people who are called by my name will, pay attention to what he says, will humble themselves, will pray, and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin and heal their land. Oftentimes we say that in order to humble yourself, you need to seek God. Well, guess what? This tells us that these two things, they don't happen one because of the other. They happen together. And we need to do both of them together. We need to humble ourselves while we are seeking God. And so we're going to talk about how we do that. We see the same type of thought if we look over Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 10, what we have here are the Beatitudes, as we refer to them, right? Blessed are they who do this, for they will have this, right? Well, one of those is, blessed are those who are meek, for they shall inherit the earth. But when we look at this, it talks about mourning, it talks about pure in heart. Blessed are those who are these things. Humbly, being a meek person is not something that is because of. It's something that we have to do. And you know how we actually know this? Another way we know this? Turn over to Philippians chapter 2. In Philippians chapter 2, let's read verse 8. This is speaking about Christ. It says, And being found in an appearance as man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Jesus was one who did the will of God. He was one who had seen the face of God. He was one who had no wicked ways. And yet, what do we find? He humbled himself, or was humbled when he came down from heaven. Many times when we look at humility, we talk about it as though it is a byproduct. We talked about it in a sense that it comes when all of these other things come. And I know I've said this a bunch already this morning. It's not. It's not a byproduct of righteousness. It's a qualification for righteousness. And if we don't recognize that, if we don't see that, then there's a problem. In order for us to be righteous, we must be humble. We have to be. This morning we're going to talk about finding humility. But we're going to talk about it and finding humility in this prideful world that we live in today. We live in a world, and it's hard sometimes to find humility amongst it. I did a Google search. I wanted to see, what do people say is the most important things in life? How do you live the best life? And all I saw was I, my, this, that, I need this, I need my goals, We get so focused on ourselves and so prideful in ourselves that we forget that there's something better to look for. So how do we do that? How do we find this humility? And the first point that I want us to make isn't really how we find it. But it's a point that needs to be made when we talk about finding it. It might not be pleasant. Finding humility and being one who is humble, it might not be the most pleasant thing in the world. It might not be something that makes us feel good about ourselves. It might not be something that makes us feel like we're the best. Over in Philippians chapter 2, verse 8, as we just read it, what did Jesus do? He humbled himself. How? How did he humble himself? Over in John chapter 6, verse 38, what we find there is it says that Jesus, leaving his home in heaven, came down. Jesus left glory. He left his true appearance. He left all that he had to come down to earth, to be made in the appearance of man. Does anybody here think that that would be pleasant? He left immortality. He left incorruptibility to be made in the appearance of man. He left and came down, as we read in Philippians 2, verse 8, to the point that he was humbled to the point of death. That is the humility that Christ had. That is his humility. Would anybody here think that that would be pleasant? Well, let's look at another. Let's go back and let's look at Genesis chapter 16. In Genesis chapter 16, I want us to read verse 6. Now, if you remember about Sarai and about Hagar. Sarai was what? She was barren, unable to have children. God made a promise to Abram, told Abram that you are going to have a child that's going to give you these blessings. Sarah, trying to help along, sends Hagar into Abram, tells her, lay with him so that he can have a son of promise, right? What does Sarai do? Let's read verse 6. It says, so Abram said to Sarai, after this has happened, indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. And when Sarah dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. Sarai, after this had happened, came back, dealt harshly with Hagar. You know what's interesting? Dealt harshly, same word that's used for humbled. Same word. When we talk about how Hagar was dealt with, it wasn't pleasant, was it? No, it wasn't. What do we see happening there after this? Hagar fled. She left Sarai. She left Abram because of how she was dealt with. Wasn't pleasant. And sometimes when we are having to be reminded of something, right? Something maybe we already knew, maybe we've already learned, and yet we forgot. Maybe we get in a little bit of trouble because we forgot. And we have to be reminded of it. Maybe we have to be, we use the phrase, put in our place. Is it ever pleasant? Do you ever like being reminded that you messed up? I don't. It happens more than I like, but I don't. I don't like being reminded of it. It's not pleasant to me. But you know what else wasn't pleasant? Let's look at something else. In Numbers chapter 30. In Numbers chapter 30, verses 10 through 15. Here it's talking about vows that were taken, but specifically vows that were taken by a wife. And it talks about how a vow that's taken by a wife, the husband, under the law of Moses, could come in and say, that vow is void. I'm not letting her do that. But that's not what I want us to focus on this morning. I want us to look at verse 13. Because this tells us something very specific about these vows. It says, every vow and every binding oath to afflict her soul, her husband may confirm it or her husband may make it void. You know what? That word, afflict, same word used for humbled again. When we are humbled, it should be felt. It is not something that is merely words, as many people do today. It is something that we should feel. Over in Numbers chapter 6, we're not going to read from there this morning, but I want to make mention of it. In Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 21, what we have is the Nazirite vow. And it talks about all the things that they cannot do. Cannot drink wine, cannot have anything made from vinegar, cannot have grapes, cannot cut their hair, cannot be around the dead. Even their own family, they cannot be around the dead. When you go on and you read verses 9 through 21, then it says if you do mess up, if you're around the dead accidentally, here's all the things that you have to do. This vow was not easy. It wasn't an easy vow for them to keep. It was afflicting. Being humbled can be afflicting. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be easy to be humbled. But you know why that is? Because being humbled isn't somebody standing up, receiving an award and saying, I am so humbled that I have this award. That's not humbled. Humbled isn't a response, and it's not really a feeling either. Humbled is a way and a walk of life. It's a way that we carry ourselves. It's a way that we interact with people. It's not me just saying something. It's what I do. It's how I do things. So let's actually talk about how do we humble ourselves. And I'm not saying, I want to make this very clear this morning, I'm not saying that we don't need to open up our word and we don't need to study it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the opposite. We do. I'm not saying that we don't need to pray and ask God for His strength. We do. What I'm saying is that when we open up our word, when we ask God for His strength, here is what we actually find. And the first is this. In order for us to be humbled, we must associate with the right people. We have to make sure that our association is right. Over in Romans chapter 12, verse 16. In Romans 12, verse 16, it says, be of the same mind toward one another. Paul, in his wonderful wisdom, he very often told them, be of the same mind. Be united and be together. He says, be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. We need to humble ourselves, and we do so by associating with those who are humbled. Why is that? Why is that? Well, to answer this, we could just say, well, because you become like those you're around. And that would be accurate. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, this is a verse that maybe we don't know we know, but we do. It tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, it says, evil company corrupts good habits or good morals. It corrupts the good. When we associate with those who are evil, with those who have done wrong, what ends up happening? Well, our good habits, our good morals get corrupted too. So what happens the other way? Because you see, association has influence, doesn't it? What happens the other way when we associate ourselves with those who are good, with those who are humbled people? And this is what happens. It doesn't destroy, and it doesn't destroy good morals. It creates them. It reinforces them. It builds them. It nurtures them. You see, this is something that would have been very difficult for the Greek to do. For those who Paul was telling, associate with the humble. It would have been hard for them. You know why? Because when we look at the Greek, when we look at the Romans, when we look at those, they looked at those who were humbled as weak. They looked at those who were humbled as something to be abhorred. It wasn't just something that they say, oh yeah, I don't want to be like them. It was, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with them. I'm not going to be around them. I'm not going to let their weakness wear off on me. Today, many see humility in the same way. They might say, I'm humbled, but are they? Their actions might not show it, do they? They're looking out for themselves. Because when we actually are humbled, when we're around those who are humbled, do you know what else we're actually around? I wanted to make this point. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2. I want to make this point because humility is not weakness. Humility is not saying that I need help all the time. That's not what humility is. Humility is this. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2. When pride comes in, comes shame, but with the humble is wisdom. Humility is wisdom. We associate with those who are wise. Why? So that we too can become wise. Not in our own eyes and not in our own mind, but in accordance with the Word, the Scripture. We have to be able to make sure we have the right association. But we also have to make sure we have acceptance. Now, I'm not talking about the acceptance that we hear on the news or on the media or anywhere else that we look out in the Facebooks and social media. No. I'm talking about a different type of acceptance. Over in Genesis chapter 16, verse 9. Let's go back to this story of Hagar. Let's go back to this story of Hagar because she really is a great lesson for us. It says in verse 9, this is after she has been afflicted, been dealt harshly with. It says, and the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Angel of the Lord came back and says, go back to Sarai. Submit yourself to her. Do you think that's easy? Hagar could look at it and say, she's the one who told me to go lay with her husband in the first place. What right did she have to deal with me that way? And she could have looked at it and says, I'm not going back. But right or wrong, she needed to accept it. Right or wrong, when we are dealt with, we do need to accept it. Maybe we look at we were dealt with wrong, but can we accept it and build and grow and make ourselves better? Absolutely. Absolutely we can, because when we are disciplined and we are chastised, we build humility. It's hard. It's hard to accept the fact that we have been disciplined. It's hard to accept that, especially when we think that we were wronged in the process of it. But we need to. We need to accept it. Because over in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, it says, now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, despite the fact that it's not joyful and it's painful, that's what he's saying, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. It yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. Accepting it builds peace. We ought to seek our lives to be those who have peace. Can we have peace if we are those who choose pride? Look at social medias today and look at what's going on. People are so proud of their own, sometimes lack of knowledge, that they want to tell everybody what they think. They want to tell everybody what they want and what they think they're doing wrong. What are they actually building? It's not peace, is it? It's fights. It's divisions. And sometimes they do it on purpose. That's the worst part. You see, what we need to do is seek not for pride and not for that, but to seek for peace. Israel, they sought pride. They sought themselves, didn't they? And when they did, what came? Destruction. Their destruction. We see this being taught when we look over in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18. In Proverbs 16, verse 18, it says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." We need to accept discipline when it comes. But I want to somewhat end this morning, kind of where we began last week, though. Last week, we talked about being able to recognize our worries and our anxiety. This week, we're going to talk about how we need to be able to recognize that we have a need for humility. We need to recognize where our place actually is. Where do we actually stand in the grand theme of things? Because we think that we're a lot higher than we really are. I want us to read from Mark chapter 10 this morning. Because as we talk about actually being able to recognize it, we need to realize that this too, it might take some practice. It might actually take some work for us to realize, where do we stand? Over here in Mark chapter 10. In Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 35, it says, "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him saying, 'Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask.'" That in and of itself sounds prideful, doesn't it? We want you to do for us whatever we want. Well, let's see what they asked. And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant us that we may sit one on your right hand and the other on your left in your glory." Well, now we see even more pride, don't we? They had to learn. They were those who had followed Christ around, watching and seeing how much of a servant he was to everybody else. And yet they still didn't quite get it yet, did they? They still had to learn it. They still needed to recognize it. So do we. And so did Peter. We read over in John chapter 13 this morning. Over here in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17, here we find the story about Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. But I want us to focus here. Focus on verse 6, or beginning in verse 6. It says, "Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, 'Lord, are you washing my feet?' Jesus answered and said to him, 'What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this.'" Now, Peter didn't want him to, did he? Jesus even tells him, "You don't really get this yet, but you're going to." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Well, Simon Peter kind of went off a little bit, didn't he? He went off to a different end, but I want us to go down to verse 17. And I want us to look at what did Jesus say there. He says, "If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." In order for him to be able to do those things, to be that servant that Jesus is showing him, this is how you live, this is how you humble yourselves in your life. In order for him to do them, he first had to learn them. In order for us to be humbled, we first need to learn where our place actually is. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Even with those like the Jewish leaders, they were those who truly had the book. They had everything that was leading up to Jesus. Knowing what was coming, knowing the prophecies. And yet what did they still refuse to do? They refused to accept where their place actually was. They refused to let go of their position and the power that they had here on earth and said, "No, we still want it." They refused to recognize it and accept their place. And that's really the next point that we get to. Not only do you have to recognize our place, but we have to accept where our place is. I can say, yeah, I recognize that my place really is down here, but how am I living my life? Well, like it's right about here. Accept that it's down there. Live like it's down there. Paul did this. Paul was one who was raised by and taught by the Jewish leaders, taught by one of the greatest Jewish leaders of his time, And yet, Paul was able to actually accept his place. Romans chapter 1, verse 14, Paul refers to himself as a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians. Paul refers to himself as a debtor to all man. Go down, we can also look in Romans, or go up, and we can look in Romans chapter 1, verse 1, as well as 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5, and really see why he was able to say that. Why he was able to say, I am a debtor. In Romans chapter 1, verse 1, we see the same thing that we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5. It says, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. He was able to recognize and accept his place in that he was a servant of Christ. That he had a job and a duty to do. And it was not about him. When we look at all those who were righteous throughout the Word of God, what we find is that they accepted their place. They recognized where they actually sat in the grand theme of things. This morning, as we draw our lesson to a close, I want to ask two things. One, am I humbled? Easy question. Might not be so easy of an answer though, huh? Am I humbled? Think about ourselves. Think about our life. And then the other goes right along with it. Am I seeking righteousness? Am I one who by living the life I am truly seeking after the righteousness of God? Where do I sit? This morning, if you're one who has not yet been baptized, who has not yet had the sins forgiven of them, that feeling of having our sins forgiven is the most humbling feeling that we can have. Because nobody else can do that. Only Christ. If you've already had your sins forgiven and maybe we have turned back and decided to walk in our own selfish and prideful manner, and maybe we need to repent of sins in a public manner, asking for forgiveness, that opportunity exists as well. Or maybe we need prayers. We talked about association. We are able to associate with one another through prayer as well. Give us that opportunity. Let us pray for one another and associate with one another, because when we go to the Heavenly Father, when we recognize our position and when we say that we need help and we need strength, what is it that we are doing? We are associating with the humble. Whatever the case may be this morning, we ask you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.